Hello, and welcome to Reliability 201 Self-Reporting Best Practices. My name is Shana Horton. I'm the Manager of Enforcement here at Texas RE, and we're glad you could join us. On your screen right now, you'll see Texas RE's antitrust admonition for your review. If you have any questions about this, please feel free to reach out to our General Counsel. Today, we are talking about self-reporting best practices. First of all, why is self-reporting best practices important to you? What can you get out of putting together a really excellent self-report? Second, we'll discuss the number one issue that we have when we receive self-reports, and that is mitigation. And we will learn how to input the best possible mitigation information at the first get-go. Then we'll talk a little bit about extent of condition, which is another item that you will be entering into the system. Third, we'll talk about root cause, and then we'll talk a little bit about risk analysis. And finally, we'll touch on self-logging, which is a different program than self-reporting, and we'll talk about how it's different when we get there. So first of all, why is it important to you to learn how to put together a really good self-report? The main reason is that it takes a lot less time and a lot less work for you if you put in some effort on the front end. If you put together a really good self-report, we're not going to have to ask you nearly as many questions. Those are called RFIs, or requests for information. And those can really slow things down as we go through the back and forth of asking the question and then waiting on a response and then asking an additional question. If you put together a good report at the very get-go, we won't have to ask nearly as many questions and we'll save a ton of time. That gets the matter quickly off your books. Another reason that you would really want to do a good job with your self-report is that if you have done an excellent job, we may not need to, here at Texas RE, do any editing to your language. And that way, your language is what NERC and FERC will eventually see when the matter is forwarded to them. Why would you want that? Obviously, you would want it so you could characterize the potential noncompliance in your own words and couch it the way you want to couch it, and then the regulator would end up seeing your own language. The number one issue we have here at Texas RE when we are reviewing self-reports is deficiency with mitigation. And that's what we're going to start with today, just to make sure that we hit it really hard. Every time you submit a self-report, you're going to need to submit at least two types of mitigation. As you can see here, we've got two buckets. The first one is your end of noncompliance. You will need to submit some sort of mitigation that stops the noncompliance from occurring. Second, you'll need to submit a type of mitigation that will prevent recurrence in the future of a same or similar potential noncompliance. There may be more than one thing you do to prevent recurrence, but you will have a minimum of two mitigation action items: an end of noncompliance with the date on which that noncompliance ended, plus at least one prevention of recurrence mitigation strategy. You can see in some of our standard RFIs how this looks. Our standard RFI for the end of noncompliance states, upload to the secure evidence locker the dated documented evidence that reflects the action the entity has taken or will take to end the noncompliance. For actions that will be taken in the future, please provide the estimated date of implementation. If you fail to put this information in the beginning, you will receive an RFI that looks just like that. Likewise, for end of noncompliance, RFI standard language says, save an action into a line, the mitigation milestone that reflects the action the entity has taken or will take to end the noncompliance. Now, save an action into a line is sort of a term of art that's used in a line. And what it is, it's just the button that you click when you are done entering the information. We'll be talking a lot about Align today. Align is, of course, the program that we use for submissions of your self-reports. And if you would like to learn more about Align and maybe get some more background on it, I wanted to mention that you can learn more about Align and the Secure Evidence Locker in Texas RE's Reliability 101, Intro to Align, which you will find the same place that you found this module. The RFI for mitigation milestone to end noncompliance also requires that within the milestone, you identify by file name the dated documented evidence that was uploaded to the Secure Evidence Locker in response to the previous question. So if you follow what these two RFIs are asking when you initially enter and input your mitigation milestones into Align, then you will save yourself the hassle of having to go back and do it later when we send you RFIs. Another important thing to keep in mind when you're submitting mitigation is that your mitigation must address the root cause of the problem. The best way to think about this is you might even want to go backwards and think about, okay, well, what mitigation did we end up doing? What kind of steps did we take to make sure it won't happen again? What steps did we take to stop the noncompliance? And then go backwards to root cause from that. So for example, we revised a procedure to include or emphasize important information. Well, the root cause then would be no or inadequate procedures. So you can come at it from either direction, starting with root cause and going toward mitigation, or if it's easier, starting with your mitigation and then backing out into root cause. Another example, an employee did not understand the requirements of the standard. The matching mitigation for that would be to provide additional training to that class of employees. A third example, root cause was lack of preventative controls to ensure timely compliance. So what you would need to do for your mitigation is to identify those preventative controls that you have added. So something like added calendar reminders ahead of due dates. So as you can see, each of these is two sides of the same coin. Here's some more examples. Here's a PRC 5-6, entity failed to perform scheduled maintenance. The first bucket for the end of noncompliance, you would need to put in maintenance performed and give us the date. That's the date that you ended the noncompliance, and that's always a very important date for us to have. The second bucket, prevention of recurrence, maybe something like added calendar reminders. Let us know what date you did that on. Give us some evidence of those calendar reminders in the SEL. Provided training to relevant employees on, give us, once again, a date, and provide us some evidence of training, such as a slideshow and maybe a sign-in sheet, and those things uploaded to the SEL. Here's another example for a SIP 8. The entity performed a cybersecurity incident response plan, but not with a reportable incident. So at the end of the noncompliance, you would need to tell us when did you go ahead and complete that qualifying CSRP exercise, give us the date, and then for prevention of recurrence, what was it that went wrong that ended up doing a non-qualifying CSRP? Well, in this case, they wanted to have an extra layer of review of the CSRP exercise to make sure that it was compliant. So the entity updated their procedure surrounding CSRPs to require a management review of the exercise prior to the performance. And that dated procedure was provided in the Secure Evidence Locker. So these are some great examples of mitigation, end of noncompliance, and prevention of recurrence. Let's move on to the next field that you'll be entering in Align, extent of condition review. Extent of condition review, we often get very, very brief statements, and we want to make sure that everything we get has at least this basic information. First of all, what did you do? That's going to be a word like review or analyze or something like that. Second, and this is probably the most important, how many sites, devices, components, procedures, or personnel did you review? What was the entire universe of things that you needed to look over to make sure that this didn't happen somewhere else. Another limiting factor that you'll need to let us know is what time period of years. We went back to 2023, or we went back through 6 months of this data. What time period did you review in your extent of condition? And then finally, you'll want to let us know, well, did you find any additional instances? In that case, what we're trying to find out from your extent of condition is to demonstrate that the issue was the only occurrence across the field of related sites, devices, components, procedures, or personnel, that universe, within that time period. However, if you did find additional instances, you will want to note those instances in your extent of condition and include them in the count of instances that you input at the beginning of a line. In other words, it will be part and parcel of the single line record. Some examples of extent of condition review. Here's an inadequate one. EOC performed, yes. Detailed description, no additional instances found. So you can see here, we are missing some information. The only thing that we have is that no additional instances were found, but we are missing information about what was done, what the universe of things was looked at, and what the time period was over which you looked at those things. A better example here is number 2. EOC performed, yes. Detailed description. The entity conducted an extent of condition review, reviewing what we did, all 13 BES elements, digital fault recorders requiring dynamic disturbance reporting. That's the universe of things, and did not identify additional instances. In this case, it's probably not necessary to include a time period because they are reviewing all of their elements. Further review of extent of condition was not required. So this, at the bottom of the screen, I want to point out that sometimes, occasionally, you will have an incident where there's no need to perform a further extent of condition review. In that case, the language you're going to use is further review of extent of condition was not required because, and you may have a different because, but a lot of times it's because the circumstances were unique or they were limited to a single facility and you reviewed the whole facility. And so you didn't need to go outside. Maybe you only have a single facility, so there's no other facilities to look at. There can be numerous reasons, but if you feel that the extent of condition review is not necessary because there is no reason to believe that there could be additional instances elsewhere, then this is the language that you're going to use. Now let's talk about the next thing you're going to have to select in a line, and that's root cause. The root cause we like to think of as an exercise in the 5 whys. Originally, you think of the thing that happened and you think of a first idea of what the root cause was. And often that idea is something like, someone made a mistake. Well, that is a cause, but is that the root cause? Ask yourself why. Why is that happening? Why did someone make a mistake? Did someone make a mistake because they needed more training? Did someone make a mistake because they didn't have a good procedure to follow? Did they make a mistake because perhaps they needed more oversight? Why is that? Why is that? Ask yourself why at least 3 or 4 times. But if you ask yourself 5 times, the last answer is going to be your actual root cause. Just remember that you need to keep drilling down. It's kind of like, I have a small child. When I tell her, you can't have that candy, and she says, why? And I say, because mom said so. Well, she's going to ask me again, why? Okay, because it's not healthy for you. Why? Because it has too much fat and sugar. You get the idea. You have to drill down to get to the root cause. So continue to ask yourself why something happened until you can't come up with any further whys. Root cause, you will be choosing a code. These are some of the most commonly cited root cause codes. Code 1 is change management. This often is selected when something like you've acquired a new asset and brought that online, and then there were maybe some effects of that happened down the line that were unanticipated, or you have deployed a new software and something wasn't updated for the deployment of that after the deployment of that software. Or it could be that there was a personnel change and something dropped the ball as part of that personnel change and someone didn't get updated about what they were supposed to be doing. So change management is a very common reason for a root cause of a potential noncompliance. Some other root causes we see a lot of are ineffective process flow system design, lack of deficient or deficient policy or procedure. That can either be at the company-wide level or at the department or business level. A really common one is ineffective preventive controls. As you all know, a great deal of what your compliance program is made up of is internal controls that are designed to prevent noncompliance. So often we'll find that when something occurs that is unanticipated or that is a potential noncompliance, it's because there wasn't something in place, an internal control in place to prevent it, or the internal control was somehow lacking. These internal controls might be things like a checklist, secondary reviewer, workflow, or a backup or a redundant control. Similarly, we see a lot of ineffective validation and detective controls. And then the last two that we see most commonly are additional training needed or lack of or deficient training materials and content. And this is one that we see a lot when an individual has simply made a mistake in their job, is that they probably needed additional training. On that note, I would say there is one root cause that we don't favor and that we rarely will find to be the actual last root cause why, and that is human performance. It is an option that you can choose. However, it's often the first why. Someone made a mistake, but it's rarely the last why. Why did that person make the mistake? Well, they didn't have the training. They didn't have the internal control. There was a lack of oversight. There's almost never this human performance going to be the last why. So if you are leaning towards human performance as your root cause, remember to ask yourself the 5 whys and make sure that that's as far as you can go with it. If you do give us human performance error, it's most often going to result in an RFI where we say, are you sure that it was human performance error and there isn't some further drilled down reason that we can find. So we definitely recommend that you think about that before you make that selection. Let's move on to the next field that you will be inputting in your potential noncompliance in Align. And this is risk analysis. For risk analysis, there are a lot of things that we typically look for. And the purpose of these slides is just to let you know what those things are. If you include these things, we might be able to put together a risk analysis without having to ask you further questions through RFIs. So for generators, some of the things that we would like to know is if there was a low capacity factor, whether or not you're a Black Start resource or relied upon for system restoration, whether you're generally relied upon for ancillary services, and whether the facility's energy output or capacity was affected. All of these things are going to play into how high the risk was of impact to the BESS system from your potential noncompliance. For transmission facilities, some of the things that we'd like to know are any of the facilities affected involved in an interconnection reliability operating limit, IROL, intra-area interfaces, and no system operating limits were violated. Those are all important pieces of information for the risk analysis. Perhaps the risk was lowered because the deviation from the standard was well below the capacity of the facility. Perhaps there was low traffic on the affected facility. Did no system issues occur due to the noncompliance? And finally, we'd like to know if there had been a loss at the facility, there was sufficient capacity at other facilities. In other words, we couldn't transmit that direction on that line, but we had plenty of capacity through other routes. This is kind of a busy slide with a lot of information, but these are pieces of information that you might want to include in general, whether you're a generator or a transmission operator. And I'd really like to draw your attention to the first one, and that is low percentage of affected facilities, assets, elements, equipment, etc. This is going to come in handy. It's especially important for SIP cases. We're going to ask you how many of your assets or elements were impacted, and then we're going to need to know in every case, and how many of that type of asset or element do you have overall. For example, if you have, 5 out of 100 of your elements went down, that's not nearly as bad as if you had 8 out of 10. So that's going to all play into the risk analysis. So make sure that you're giving us both the number impacted and the number that's the total number of the similar elements. Another thing that might be risk limiting is if it was a small deviation from the applicable requirement. Maybe you were just inside or outside of the tolerance band. Another thing that might limit the risk is a short duration of the noncompliance. Perhaps you've failed to patch, but you patched the next day or within a couple of days rather than within several months. That would definitely decrease the risk. Another option, after the review was completed, there were no updates or setting changes found to be needed and equipment was working normally. We want to know if you have any backups or redundant systems that would back up an affected non-compliant device. This is also important for SIP cases. In a lot of cases, you're going to have something like a missed patch, but you have other systems in place to prevent malign actors from gaining access. We'll want to know if any harm occurred, if there were any relay operations, impacts to neighboring utilities or entities. One thing that would also limit risk is if this is something where you were supposed to provide information, maybe to ERCOT, if you had provided that information in an alternative manner, or if you've provided partial information, those would be relevant to limiting the risk of failure to provide information. If there had been an alarm, if there had been an issue with the affected equipment, that's a sort of a backup system we'd like to know about. And when it comes to training, this is a really helpful one. And since training is such a common denominator, if the training was missed or late, we would like to know if any of the people that were subject to that training had previously had the training at a different cycle. For example, perhaps the training is required every 15 months and you have 10 employees that have to have that training. However, only one of them was new within the last 15 months. So 9 of those employees had already had the training and at a different interval and just needed the refresher. That is something that limits the risk from missed or late training. Okay, so I told you we were going to talk a little bit about self-logging. Self-logging is a program within the self-reporting realm. And what we do with self-logs is essentially you apply to be part of the program, and we review your history and what we know about you here at Texas RE. And what we are trying to decide is if we can presume the accuracy and completeness of your self-reports. So if you've been doing great self-reports, if you've been using all of these tips, if you've been providing a lot of information for risk analysis, if you've been really accurate with your root cause, all of those things, you might get into the self-log program and be able to get a faster turnaround. And that is what the advantage of the self-log program is that presumption of accuracy and completeness that we give you means that we might be able to pass through your language that you've written without any further editing or revision from us here at Texas RE. Now, keep in mind the requirements for a self-log are exactly the same as far as information as is required for a self-report. So you're not giving us less information, and it's not quicker in that way. What's quicker is in our review where we presume the accuracy and completeness. We do analyze as usual. However, again, if we agree that your language tells the story clearly, if you have addressed all the elements in the way that we think is complete and accurate, then we might be able to pass that language through, and NERC and FERC will see how you have characterized your own potential noncompliance using your own words. Keep in mind that this is for minimal risk only. So if we're going into moderate risk, you will not be able to self-log that moderate risk issue. And you can see here on the left, self-logs are much faster. I looked at over the last 5 years or so that self-reports, which is what we've been talking about, are generally, it varies from year to year, but about a year from start to finish to get that through our analysis and filing with FERC. Self-logs, on the other hand, much faster, about 3.5 months. So you get those things off your books in a timely manner. And we really encourage you to reach out to us if you are interested in the self-log program, and we can help you learn how to apply for that and help you through that application process. If you do get to be part of the self-log program, one resource that you have here is what I'm showing you on the screen. NERC has all of their non-SIP, so O&P only self-logs that they have approved on their website. So you can navigate to this website, and I'll have a link on the next page. You can navigate to this website, and by year you can open up and see what has worked, and you can see by the standard. So you might, if you have a self-log for a particular standard, you might search for one that has been approved under that standard and sort of use that as a template or as an idea starting point for how you want to fill in your self-log for that same standard. So once again, let's circle back around to mitigation, our number one issue, our number one sticky wicket that we have here when people are putting in their own self-reports. Just remember these things. You're going to need one mitigation to end noncompliance. You're going to need one or more to prevent recurrence. So that's a minimum of 2 mitigations. The root cause and the mitigation should rhyme. In other words, they're the two sides of the same coin. One is going to fix the other. And you need to provide data evidence for the end of noncompliance. If you can do those 4 things with your mitigation content and your potential noncompliance in a line, then you're halfway there to having an excellent self-report. For some additional resources I have here on the screen, that first link is the 2026 enforcement actions that I just showed you on the last page from NERC. The second link is to a NERC guide to registered entity self-reporting and mitigation plans. And the third is the NERC guide to self-logging program for program user guide. If you have any additional questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at enforcement@texasre.org. We are always happy to discuss even prior to submission. If you'd like to call us and say, I've got a potential noncompliance coming in, I want to do a self-report, but I need to run this by you. What do you think of this mitigation? What do you think of this root cause? Maybe we're struggling with risk analysis. Can you help us out? We are happy to talk about those things even before you input them so that you make sure that your initial submission is as good as it can be. And we're always willing to take a phone call or shoot us an email, and we will help you to put together your best possible self-report. That's all I have for today. Thank you for coming by, and we'll see you around.